On May 5, 1993, in West Memphis, Arkansas, 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, rode their bikes into Robin Hood Hills to play. By nightfall, they hadn't come home. When dawn broke on May 6th, all 3 were found dead in a drainage ditch, hog-tied with their own shoelaces, naked, and brutally murdered. The violence was unimaginable. The community was shattered. Within weeks, 3 teenagers were arrested. Not on evidence, but on fear. Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley became the West Memphis 3, convicted for crimes many believe they didn't commit. For 18 years, they fought for freedom, while the real killer may have walked free. This is their story. Do you prefer listening to solved cold cases or unsolved ones? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. The afternoon started like any other. Stevie Branch said goodbye to his mother Pam and stepfather Terry Hobbs around 6:00 p.m. Michael Moore left home after helping his father with dishes. Christopher Byers raced out on his bike, full of energy. The 3 friends met at Robin Hood Hills, a wooded area near their homes where they often played. They built forts, explored trails, and lost track of time. As darkness fell, they should have headed home. They never did. At 8 p.m., Pam Hobbs called police. Stevie was missing. So were Michael and Chris. Terry Hobbs and neighbors grabbed flashlights and searched the woods, calling the boys' names into the darkness. Police arrived quickly. Volunteers joined the search. But the woods were vast and visibility poor. At 3:00 a.m., the search was suspended until daylight. Dawn brought dread. More volunteers arrived. Helicopters circled overhead. At 1:30 p.m. on May 6th, Officer Mike Allen spotted a child's shoe floating in a drainage ditch. Moments later, he found Michael Moore's body submerged in muddy water. Within minutes, Stevie and Christopher were discovered nearby. All 3 were hog-tied, naked, and showed signs of severe trauma. The crime scene was horrific. Medical examiner Dr. Frank Peretti found blunt force trauma to all 3 victims. Christopher's body had been mutilated, his genitals removed with a sharp instrument. The boys had drowned, unconscious from their injuries when placed in the water. Death occurred sometime between 7:00 p.m. on May 5th and early morning May 6th. The investigation was flawed from the start. The crime scene had been contaminated by hundreds of searchers. Critical evidence was mishandled. No blood was found at the scene despite the violence, suggesting the boys were killed elsewhere and moved. This possibility wasn't thoroughly explored. Detective Gary Gitchell led the case under immense pressure. The community demanded answers. Within days, rumors spread about satanic cults. West Memphis in 1993 was gripped by satanic panic, nationwide hysteria about devil-worshipping cults targeting children. Fear transformed into suspicion. On May 10th, police interviewed Damien Echols. The 18-year-old wore black clothing, listened to heavy metal, and studied Wicca. Multiple witnesses mentioned his name, calling him weird or into devil worship. During questioning, Damien speculated the boys might have been mutilated, details not released publicly. Prosecutors would claim this showed guilty knowledge. Defense attorneys would argue he was simply making educated guesses from crime novels and news reports. Weeks passed. Police focused on Damien and his friends. On June 3rd, they brought in Jessie Misskelley Jr., a 17-year-old with an IQ of 72. Jessie knew Damien casually. Police believed he had information. The interrogation lasted 12 hours. Only 46 minutes were recorded. During the recorded portion, Jessie confessed to participating in the murders with Damien and Jason Baldwin. But his confession contradicted known facts. He said murders happened at 9 a.m. Boys were seen alive in the afternoon. He said they used rope. Victims were bound with shoelaces. He described the wrong location. Each time he erred, interrogators fed him correct information. He changed his story to match. Forensic psychologists later identified classic indicators of false confession. Jessie was interrogated for hours without breaks. He was told police knew he was involved. He was promised leniency if he cooperated. His intellectual disability made him particularly vulnerable to coercion. Despite glaring problems, police accepted the confession. On June 3rd, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley were arrested for capital murder. The arrests made national headlines. The narrative was set. 3 teenagers in a satanic cult had murdered 3 children in a ritual killing. The psychological profile of the true perpetrator tells a different story. The extreme violence suggests someone with profound rage and sadistic tendencies. The brutality wasn't random. It was personal. The killer likely knew the victims. The hog-tying demonstrated a need for control and domination, characteristics of power-assertive offenders who feel powerless in daily life and compensate through violence. The mutilation of Christopher Byers is particularly significant. Post-mortem genital mutilation is extremely rare and indicates specific psychological motivations: sexual inadequacy, rage directed at the victim, or personal vendetta. Some profilers believe the killer knew Christopher personally and harbored specific anger toward him. The killer was likely someone the boys trusted. 3 children don't follow a stranger deep into isolated woods, but they would follow a parent figure, someone they knew and obeyed. The killer was also familiar with Robin Hood Hills, comfortable operating in the area without arousing suspicion. Crucially, no physical evidence linked Damien, Jason, or Jessie to the crime. No DNA, no fibers, no witnesses. Yet all 3 were convicted. The trials began in early 1994. Jessie was tried separately in January. The prosecution relied almost entirely on his confession. Defense attorneys argued it was coerced and unreliable, pointing to factual errors and Jessie's intellectual disability. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before convicting. Jessie Misskelley Jr., age 17, was sentenced to life plus 40 years. Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin were tried together in February. Jessie's confession wasn't admissible because he refused to testify. Without it, prosecutors built their case on circumstantial evidence and prejudice. Witness Vicky Hutchison testified that Damien took her to a witches' gathering where he discussed the murders. Years later, she recanted, admitting police pressured her to lie. Another witness claimed Damien once talked about wanting to make a sacrifice. Context was unclear and contested. Prosecutors presented a knife recovered from a lake behind Jason's trailer. Forensic testing found no blood, tissue, or biological material linking it to victims. They called Dr. Dale Griffiths as an expert in occult crimes. Griffiths testified about satanic symbolism, the body positioning, the mutilation, the date's supposed ritual significance. His testimony was compelling, but Griffiths' credentials were fraudulent. His doctorate came from an unaccredited mail-order school. He had no legitimate training in forensic psychology or criminal profiling. His theories about satanic ritual abuse were debunked pseudoscience. In 1994, juries didn't know this. The defense struggled against the narrative. They presented alibi witnesses. Damien was at his girlfriend's house. Jason was home. Prosecutors impeached these witnesses as biased family and friends. Defense experts noted the absence of physical evidence should indicate innocence. Prosecutors claimed killers were careful and water destroyed evidence. Damien's behavior hurt his case. He appeared detached, sometimes smirking. Mental health experts would later explain this as a trauma response and coping mechanism. To jurors, it looked like someone without remorse. On March 19, 1994, after 9 hours of deliberation, guilty verdicts came back. Both convicted on 3 counts of capital murder. During sentencing, prosecutors sought death for Damien. Despite his troubled childhood, mental health struggles, and young age, the jury sentenced Damien Echols to death. Jason Baldwin, teen at the time of crimes, received life without parole. The 3 were separated and imprisoned. Damien went to death row at Varner Unit, a 6x9 cell, 1 hour outside daily. Jason and Jessie went to maximum security facilities. Their youth was stolen. In 1996, HBO aired Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. Filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky documented the case, revealing troubling evidence of innocence. The film showed how prosecution relied on prejudice over evidence, exposed Jessie's coerced confession, and revealed Griffiths' fake credentials. Paradise Lost sparked a movement. Legal experts expressed alarm. Activists formed organizations. Musicians, actors, and artists lent support. The case became a symbol of justice system failure. Over the next decade, defense attorneys filed appeals. Most were denied. The breakthrough came in 2007 when advanced DNA testing was ordered. Results were stunning. No DNA from the crime scene matched Damien, Jason, or Jessie. Not one fiber. Hair or biological sample linked them to victims. More significantly, DNA from an unknown male was found on ligatures binding the boys. A hair from the scene matched Terry Hobbs, Stevie's stepfather. Investigation into Hobbs revealed troubling information. Pam Hobbs divorced him after the murders and publicly stated she believed he was involved. She described his violent temper and controlling behavior. 3 witnesses provided damaging testimony. Hobbs's nephew claimed Terry admitted hurting those boys. Witnesses placed Hobbs with the boys in Robin Hood Hills on May 5th. David Jacoby, who provided Hobbs's alibi, gave inconsistent statements. Hobbs fit the psychological profile. He was someone the boys trusted. He was familiar with Robin Hood Hills. He had a history of domestic violence and controlling behavior, traits associated with the violence and domination exhibited in the murders. Yet Hobbs was never arrested or charged. He denies involvement to this day. By 2010, the case against the West Memphis 3 had crumbled. DNA evidence pointed away from them. Witness testimony was recanted. Expert testimony was debunked. Arkansas faced a crisis. Admitting wrongful conviction would expose the state to massive lawsuits and public outrage. But maintaining the convictions was becoming untenable. In August 2011, prosecutors offered an Alford plea, a legal mechanism allowing defendants to maintain innocence while acknowledging prosecution has evidence for conviction. In exchange for pleading guilty to lesser charges, all 3 would be immediately released with time served. It was an agonizing decision. Accepting meant giving up the fight for complete exoneration. They'd still be legally guilty, still convicted felons. They couldn't sue for wrongful imprisonment. The case would close, ending investigation into the real killer. But refusing meant Damien returned to death row to await execution. After 18 years, the offer of immediate freedom was impossible to ignore. Jason Baldwin initially resisted. He wanted complete vindication. But he agreed because refusing would doom Damien. He couldn't let that happen. On August 19, 2011, the West Memphis 3 stood in court and entered Alford pleas. They stated clearly they were innocent, but acknowledged the state had evidence. The judge accepted. Within hours, after 18 years and 78 days, they walked free. The moment was bittersweet. Damien embraced his wife, Lori Davis. Jason struggled to speak, overcome with emotion. Jessie, quiet and overwhelmed, was surrounded by family. But the families of Stevie, Michael, and Christopher were divided. Pam Hobbs supported the release, believing in their innocence. The Moore and Byers families felt betrayed, still convinced of guilt. Since release, the three have rebuilt their lives. Damien moved to New York, became an advocate for criminal justice reform and death penalty abolition. He wrote Life After Death, detailing his years on death row. Jason has kept low profile, struggling with PTSD. Jessie returned to West Memphis, working odd jobs, trying to move forward. The murders remain officially unsolved. No one else has been charged. Cold case investigators occasionally review files. Genealogical DNA testing offers hope. Matching crime scene DNA to family trees might finally identify the killer. Advocates push for the case to be reopened, demanding thorough investigation of Terry Hobbs. The West Memphis 3 case stands as one of America's most significant wrongful convictions. It exposes the dangerous intersection of moral panic, junk science, coerced confessions, and prejudice. It demonstrates how being different, looking different, thinking differently, can corrupt justice. The case inspired reforms in interrogation of vulnerable suspects. It led to greater scrutiny of expert testimony. It sparked conversations about the death penalty and the risk of executing innocent people. But most importantly, it keeps alive the memory of 3 8-year-old boys who deserved better. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers deserved to grow up. They deserved real justice, not false convictions and closed cases. Until their true killer is identified and held accountable, this wound remains unhealed. For their families, for West Memphis, and for everyone who believes justice should be about truth, not convenience. 3 boys rode bikes into woods on May 5, 1993, and never came home. 3 teenagers were wrongfully convicted, and somewhere, possibly still free, walks the person who truly committed these crimes. The search for justice continues. Do you prefer listening to solved cases or unsolved ones? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. The investigation that followed the discovery of the bodies revealed critical failures that would haunt the case for decades. Detective Gitchell's team collected physical evidence, but the processing was deeply flawed. The boys' clothing was bagged and tagged. The shoelaces used to bind them were preserved. Water and soil samples were taken. But chain of custody issues plagued the evidence from day one. Crime scene photographs showed inconsistencies. Some angles weren't documented. Key areas weren't thoroughly photographed before searchers trampled through. The medical examiner's report noted the time of death between 7 p.m. on May 5th and 2 a.m. on May 6th based on body temperature and rigor mortis. But witness statements weren't properly cross-referenced with this timeline. Several witnesses reported hearing screams from the woods around 9 p.m. on May 5th. One witness, living near Robin Hood Hills, told police she heard children crying and men's voices shouting. She didn't call police at the time, assuming it was teenagers playing. This lead wasn't followed up aggressively. Another witness reported seeing a black man covered in mud walking near the area around 9:30 p.m. Police briefly investigated but dismissed this after focusing on Damien. The forensic evidence, or lack thereof, should have been the most telling aspect of the investigation. No fingerprints were found on the boys' bicycles, which were recovered near the crime scene. No footprints matching Damien, Jason, or Jessie were documented. No fibers from their clothing were found on the victims. In a violent crime involving 3 perpetrators, restraining and killing 3 struggling children, the absence of any physical evidence was extraordinary. Dr. Peretti's autopsy reports provided crucial details. Stevie Branch had multiple contusions on his head face, and torso. His cause of death was drowning, but he had been rendered unconscious by blunt force trauma first. Michael Moore showed similar injuries: head trauma, drowning as cause of death. Christopher Byers had the most extensive injuries. Beyond the head trauma and drowning, his body showed signs of what Dr. Peretti initially described as knife wounds. But the mutilation of Christopher would later become a point of intense debate. In 2007, forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden reviewed the autopsy photos and crime scene evidence. Baden, one of America's most respected forensic experts, concluded that Christopher's injuries were consistent with animal predation, specifically snapping turtles and other aquatic scavengers that inhabited the drainage ditch. The wounds initially attributed to a knife showed characteristics of animal teeth marks rather than blade cuts. This finding would significantly undermine the prosecution's theory of ritualistic mutilation. The interrogation of Jessie Misskelley on June 1st remains one of the most controversial aspects of the case. The unrecorded hours are critical. What techniques were used? What promises were made? What threats were implied? Jessie's father, Big Jessie Misskelley, wasn't allowed in the interrogation room despite multiple requests. No attorney was present, despite Jessie being a minor with known intellectual disabilities. When the recording began, Jessie was already in a state of compliance. Detective Gitchell and Detective Bryn Ridge asked leading questions. "We know you were there, Jessie. We just need you to tell us what happened." Jessie's responses were hesitant, confused. He would say one thing, then change it when corrected. The interrogators showed patience when Jessie aligned with their theory, frustration when he didn't. At one point, Jessie said, "I don't know," to a question about what time the murders occurred. Ridge responded, "Well, you were there. You have to know." Jessie then guessed 9 a.m. When told that couldn't be right because the boys were at school, he changed to 12 noon. Still wrong. Witnesses saw them alive at 6 p.m. Eventually, after more prompting, Jessie settled on after school as the time frame. This pattern repeated throughout the confession. The confession included details that should have exonerated rather than implicated. Jessie said one boy was cut on the face. None were. He said they tied the boys in different positions than they were actually found. He couldn't describe what the boys were wearing, what weapons were used, or specific details about the location. Every piece of accurate information in his confession could be traced back to interrogator prompting. Yet this confession became the foundation of the state's case. Prosecutors John Fogelman and Brent Davis believed they had their killers. The confession confirmed what the community already feared. Satanic teenagers had murdered innocent children. The media frenzy intensified. News trucks from across the country parked in West Memphis. Reporters interviewed anyone with a connection to the case. The victims' families gave tearful press conferences. The defendants' families proclaimed innocence. The town was divided and traumatized. Jessie's trial in Corning lasted just 2 weeks. Judge David Burnett, who would preside over all 3 trials, ran a tight courtroom. The prosecution played Jessie's videotaped confession. Defense attorney Dan Stidham argued passionately that the confession was false, coerced from a vulnerable young man. Stidham brought in Dr. Richard Offshee, a sociologist and expert on false confessions from UC Berkeley. Dr. Offshee testified about the psychology of false confessions. He explained how certain interrogation techniques, prolonged questioning, minimization of consequences, maximization of evidence, promises of leniency, can cause innocent people to confess to crimes they didn't commit. He noted that people with intellectual disabilities are particularly susceptible. He analyzed Jessie's confession and identified classic markers of unreliability. The prosecution countered with common-sense arguments. Why would someone confess to murder if they didn't do it? Jessie knew details about the crime. He led police to a liquor bottle near the crime scene, though this bottle was never definitively linked to the murders and could have been left by anyone. Fogelman's closing argument was emotional and effective. The jury believed the confession. Conviction was swift. The trial of Damien and Jason in Jonesboro was longer and more complex. It began February 19, 1994, with jury selection. Finding impartial jurors proved nearly impossible. Nearly everyone in the area had heard about the case, formed opinions. Judge Burnett questioned potential jurors extensively about their ability to be fair despite pretrial publicity. The prosecution's opening statement painted Damien as a cult leader. Fogelman described a teenager obsessed with death, violence, and the occult who recruited Jason Baldwin and Jessie Misskelley to help him commit a satanic sacrifice. He promised to prove through witnesses and physical evidence that these defendants were responsible for the most heinous crime the community had ever seen. Defense attorney Paul Ford's opening was more subdued. He told jurors there was no physical evidence linking his clients to the crime. No blood, no DNA, no fibers, no witnesses. He asked jurors to look at the facts, not the fear. The prosecution called victim family members first. Pam Hobbs testified about Stevie's last day, her desperate search when he didn't come home, the horror of learning he'd been murdered. Todd and Dana Moore described Michael's responsible nature, their disbelief that something could happen to him. Melissa Byers gave emotional testimony about Christopher, breaking down multiple times on the stand. The testimony was heartbreaking and effective at establishing the victims' humanity and the devastating impact of their deaths. Then came the controversial witnesses. Vicki Hutchison testified about the alleged Esbot. She described Damien picking her up on May 7th, 2 days after the murders, and taking her to a wooded area. She claimed Damien talked about the murders, saying things only the killer would know. On cross-examination, Ford attacked her credibility. Why didn't she report this immediately? Why did she continue associating with Damien if she thought he was a murderer? Hutchison became flustered, her answers inconsistent. Years later, Hutchison would sign an affidavit recanting. She admitted police had pressured her to befriend Damien after the arrests. She said Detective Gitchell told her what to say. She claimed she was threatened with losing custody of her son if she didn't cooperate. She acknowledged making up the entire Esbot story. But in 1994, the jury believed her. The knife evidence was problematic for the prosecution. The knife recovered from the lake had no lead on it. Forensic testing couldn't link it to Christopher's injuries. But the prosecution's expert testified it was consistent with the wounds. The vague testimony was enough for jurors unfamiliar with forensic science. Dr. Dale Griffiths took the stand as the prosecution's occult expert. His testimony lasted hours. He showed photos of the crime scene, pointing out supposed satanic symbols. The hog-tying, he said, was consistent with ritual sacrifice. The mutilation showed occult significance. The full moon on May 5th had ritual importance. He discussed Damien's interest in Aleister Crowley, calling Crowley a Satanist. Crowley was actually a ceremonial magician, not a Satanist, but this distinction was lost on the jury. Griffiths brought props, books about witchcraft, heavy metal album covers, symbols drawn on paper. He created an atmosphere of fear and mystery. On cross-examination, defense attorneys tried to discredit him. They asked about his credentials. He admitted his doctorate was from a correspondence school. He acknowledged he'd never actually investigated a satanic crime. But the damage was done. The jury saw an expert confirming their worst fears. The defense called their own experts. Dr. William Grieco, a forensic pathologist, testified that the injuries could have occurred in many ways. He challenged the prosecution's timeline. He noted the lack of blood at the scene suggested the boys were killed elsewhere. On cross-examination, prosecutors highlighted that Grieco hadn't personally examined the bodies, only reviewed reports and photos. Character witnesses testified about Damien and Jason. Teachers described them as intelligent, but troubled kids. Friends said they were non-violent. Damien's girlfriend testified about his whereabouts on May 5th, but prosecutors effectively impeached these witnesses, suggesting bias and faulty memories. The most damaging aspect was Damien himself. He took the stand against his attorney's advice. He wanted to tell his story, but on the stand, Damien came across as arrogant and flippant. When asked about his interest in the occult, he gave academic explanations about paganism and Wicca. When asked if he believed in God, he gave a philosophical answer about different conceptions of divinity. To the jury, largely conservative Christians, this sounded like devil worship. Prosecutor Brent Davis's cross-examination was brutal. He asked Damien about his mental health hospitalizations, about statements in his medical records indicating violent thoughts, about his interest in blood drinking. Damien had told doctors he found the concept intellectually interesting after reading about historical practices. Davis took every answer and twisted it to make Damien sound dangerous and deviant. By the time Damien left the stand, the jury had seen enough. The closing arguments were passionate on both sides. Davis told jurors they had a duty to protect the community from these killers. Ford reminded them of reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 9 hours, longer than in Jessie's trial, suggesting some internal debate. When the verdicts came, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted. Victim families cried with relief. Defense families screamed in anguish. Judge Burnett gavelled for order. The sentencing phase would determine if Damien lived or died. The death penalty phase focused on aggravating versus mitigating factors. Aggravating. The murders were exceptionally heinous, involved torture, and targeted children. Mitigating. Damien was only 18, had no prior violent offenses, suffered from mental illness. The defense brought in mental health experts who testified about Damien's depression, his traumatic childhood, his treatable conditions. The prosecution brought in more victim impact testimony, reminding jurors of 3 young lives brutally ended. The jury's decision came after several hours. Death. Damien Echols would be executed by lethal injection. He was 18 years old. Jason Baldwin, spared the death penalty due to his age at the time of the crimes, would spend life in prison. At sentencing, both maintained their innocence. Both proclaimed they would fight until the truth came out. The appeals process began immediately. In Arkansas, death penalty cases receive automatic appeal, but the appeals process is lengthy, expensive, and rarely successful. Most death row inmates exhaust their appeals and are executed. Damien's attorneys filed with the Arkansas Supreme Court, arguing multiple grounds for reversal: jury prejudice, ineffective counsel, improper evidence admission, judicial errors. The Arkansas Supreme Court denied the appeal in 1996. They ruled that any errors were harmless and didn't affect the outcome. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Damien's execution date was set, then stayed pending further appeals. This cycle would repeat multiple times over the next 18 years. Meanwhile, Paradise Lost aired. The documentary's impact cannot be overstated. People who watched it came away convinced of a miscarriage of justice. Websites were created. A support organization, mthruwa.org, launched. Donations poured in for legal defense. High-profile supporters emerged. Musicians like Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, Henry Rollins, and Metallica. Actor Johnny Depp became involved, eventually financing significant portions of the legal defense. The movement grew. Rallies were held. T-shirts proclaimed, "Free the WM3." The case became a cause célèbre among those concerned with wrongful convictions. But in Arkansas, particularly in West Memphis, opinion remained divided. Many locals resented the outside interference, the implication that their justice system had failed. They believed the right people were in prison. The victims' families were split. Pam Hobbs began having doubts about the convictions by the early 2000s. She looked at the evidence more carefully. She researched false confessions and flawed forensic science. She began to suspect her ex-husband Terry might know more than he'd revealed. By 2007, she publicly announced her belief that the West Memphis Three were innocent. The Moore and Byers families remained convinced of guilt. They felt betrayed by the movement to free the convicted. To them, this was a personal attack on their children's memory and their quest for justice. The divisions within the victim families added another layer of tragedy to the case. In 2000, when DNA testing was ordered, expectations were high. Modern DNA technology could finally provide answers. Defense attorneys submitted clothing from the victims, the ligatures, soil samples, everything that might yield biological evidence. The state crime lab and independent labs conducted testing. Results came back in phases. First result: no DNA from Damien, Jason, or Jessie on any of the evidence. This should have been exonerating. The prosecution argued absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe the killers were careful. Maybe water washed away evidence. Second result: unknown male DNA on ligatures. This was more significant. Someone else had handled those shoelaces. The defense requested the DNA be run through CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. No matches. Whoever left that DNA had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA submission. Third result: the hair. Mitochondrial DNA testing on a hair recovered from the crime scene showed consistency with Terry Hobbs's maternal lineage. Mitochondrial DNA is less specific than nuclear DNA. Many people could share the same mitochondrial profile, but it was enough to warrant investigation. Defense investigators began looking at Terry Hobbs seriously. They interviewed neighbors, family members, people who knew him. A picture emerged of a man with a violent temper who controlled his family through fear. Witnesses described incidents of domestic violence against Pam. Some described verbal and physical abuse toward Stevie. The most explosive information came from 3 witnesses who provided sworn statements. Terry's nephew, Michael Hobbs Jr., said Terry had confessed to him in 2004. According to Michael, Terry was drunk and emotional when he admitted hurting those boys. Michael didn't go to police immediately because he feared Terry. Jamie Clark, who was friends with the Hobbs family, stated that Terry acted strangely after the murders. He seemed emotionless, didn't participate in searches the way other parents did, and made odd comments about the case. She remembered Terry saying the bodies were found hogtied before this information was public. Most damning, Deborah Moyer gave a statement that she'd seen Terry Hobbs and David Jacoby with the 3 boys in Robin Hood Hills around 6:30 p.m. on May 5th. She'd been driving near the area and recognized Terry. She saw him talking to the boys, who were on their bikes. She didn't think anything of it at the time. Terry was Stevie's stepfather, but the sighting was significant given the timeline. David Jacoby had provided Terry's original alibi. He testified they'd been together at Jacoby's house that evening. But when re-interviewed by defense investigators, Jacoby's story changed. He became uncertain about times, about what they did, about when Terry left. His shifting account raised questions about whether he was covering for Terry. Terry Hobbs denied everything. He said he never confessed to anyone. He claimed Moyer was mistaken or lying. He said his DNA at the crime scene could be explained. He'd been at Robin Hood Hills searching for Stevie, so it was natural his hair might be there. The defense countered that Terry claimed he never entered the woods during his search, only called from the edge. How would his hair end up with the bodies? A psychological profile commissioned by the defense painted Terry as fitting the perpetrator profile better than Damien ever did. The profile noted Terry's history of domestic violence, his controlling personality, his volatile temper. These traits aligned with the rage and need for control demonstrated in the murders. The profile suggested a scenario where Terry encountered the boys. Something happened that enraged him. Perhaps Stevie talked back. Perhaps the boys witnessed something they shouldn't have, and Terry snapped. In this scenario, the murders weren't premeditated satanic ritual. They were rage killings by someone who lost control. The hog-tying could have been Terry's way of restraining the boys, perhaps learned from his time in the military or from hunting. The bodies being placed in water could have been an attempt to destroy evidence, but this remained speculation. No physical evidence definitively linked Terry to the murders beyond the hair, which wasn't conclusive. No witnesses came forward saying they saw Terry kill the boys. Without more, prosecutors wouldn't bring charges. The Arkansas Attorney General's office, now defending the state against the new evidence, argued that the day findings didn't prove innocence. They maintained that Jessie's confession, despite its flaws, contained information only the killer would know. They argued the jury verdicts should stand. But behind the scenes, the state knew they had problems. If the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered new trials based on the DNA evidence, there was significant risk of acquittal. Damien, Jason, and Jessie had been in prison for 18 years. Public opinion had shifted. Proving the case beyond reasonable doubt with such compromised evidence would be nearly impossible. The Alford plea emerged as a solution. It allowed the state to maintain the convictions while releasing the prisoners. It avoided the expense and uncertainty of new trials. It prevented wrongful conviction lawsuits. For prosecutors, it was face-saving. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, it was an impossible choice. Freedom versus truth. After 18 years, the choice was clear. On August 19, 2011, they entered Alford pleas and walked free. The story doesn't end there. Questions remain. Will the case ever be reopened? Will Terry Hobbs ever be charged? Will genealogical DNA technology finally identify the unknown male whose DNA was on the ligatures? The West Memphis. 3 are free, but justice hasn't been served. 3 little boys were murdered. The person who killed them has never been held accountable. That's the real tragedy. Beyond the wrongful convictions, beyond the years stolen from Damien, Jason, and Jessie, is the fact that Stevie, Michael, and Christopher never got real justice. Their killer is still out there. Do you prefer listening to solved cold cases or unsolved ones? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.